Okay, I think we're there. You can start, Linda.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's fine meeting. As you can see, it's a new face, so hopefully I won't make too many mistakes. Just to introduce myself, my name is Lindelani Makuya, and I'm a research manager at the Sakhalin Karoo Research Station in South Africa, and also doing my PhD looking at the costs and benefits of solitary living in the Bush Karoo Red at the University of the Witwatersrand. And I'm a colleague of Konstanz. And currently I am visiting the CNRS here in Strasbourg, which is why I'm able to host today's fine. Usually I'm in the field with very limited to zero network signal. So it's refreshing to be able to be in contact with everyone. So today's speaker will be Michael Griesser. He is a researcher currently working at the University of Konstanz. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And his research has been to understand the evolution of family living and cooperative breeding, where they works with a number of bird species using a comparative field approach. This in the field is best known for ecology, predation, and habitat. And his ecology on the Siberian jay the Siberian jay is his key species that he's been working on since his PhD to date. What else? Okay, so the main themes of his work throughout his career has been, as I mentioned, ecology, predation, nest, habitat, and biological dispersal, with ecology being closely attributed to his zoological work. His predation study integrates concerns from other disciplines such as paternal investment and life history theory. And then he's most often published in this. He most often published in this field. The highest one being in ecology, predation, and finally the nest. So today he will be talking to us about. His topic will be on cooperative breeding, or why family living matters for cooperation. And just to give a brief summary of that, cooperative breeding is an extreme form of cooperation that evolved in a range of lineages, but the factors favoring its evolution remain debated. So using phylogenetic comparative work, he's shown that this behavior evolves in two steps. First, with where families form by prolonging parent-offspring associations, and second, where offspring begin helping at the nest. And as I mentioned, his long-term study system has been the Siberian jay that shows the adaptive value of family living. So I will hand now over to Michael to give his talk. So the structure of the day will be, we'll first go to Michael, where he'll give us a 45-minute talk. This will be followed by questions and finally an interactive Q&A at the end. So over to you, Michael.
Oh, thank you very much, Lindelani. Let's share my screen. Okay, so you all hear me, you see my shared screen, and yes, okay, cool. So let's start with this. I mean, I obviously very happy being here. I thank everyone that is involved in inviting me. I've already spoken to quite some of you and had really interesting discussions. So as you might see, I actually changed the title as it is. You do things and realize, well, maybe the title needs also some adjustments. So I'm not only going to talk about family living and kin cooperation, but also what this has to do with big brains. Right, so I would actually like to start with a short video clip of a behavior that if you are a bird biologist, you might not be bothered. If you are a non-bird biologist and well, maybe not really familiar with behavioral ecology, you might really think this is intriguing. So let's start with this. So it shows you basically parental care behavior in Florida platform. Oh, sorry. So, okay. So some of you might think this is actually a normal behavior, whereas others of you are a little bit puzzled. I mean, what you have been seeing is called cooperative breeding. And so an individual is not a parent, comes to a nest and feeds young. I mean, it basically turns things, as we know from Charles Darwin and his Origin of the Species, a bit upside down. I mean, Charles Darwin was really strongly arguing for, natural selection. So this is competitive. And if things are competitive, what should you do? So, basically you should fight to spread your own genes. You should not go out and, be nice to others. So, if you look there, in most cases, actually animal interactions often are very competitive. And so really puzzling, why should individuals then cooperate? Sure, I mean, some of you might know the answer, but still, this is really a puzzling question. Now, if you look into the world where this is what's labeled cooperative breeding, so where others than parents care for young, is actually quite widespread. So it's more than 10% of species that do this. And so it's not only found in the Florida scrapjay, you also have the North American acorn woodpecker, you have the Central American greater any or the Australian superb fairy wren doing this. And so actually, already Charles Darwin realized that things like this should not happen. So he himself couldn't explain it. Now, just as an interesting historical side note, so the painting of the superb fairy wren you can see here, that was done in 1840. So before Charles Darwin was doing his On the Origin of Species book. And it's basically in the book of Australian birds by John Gould. And everyone thinks like, okay, it's all cool, but there's two twists to this, or actually even three. I mean, the first twist is, okay, yes, so this is the picture of cooperative breeding, because you can see here two males that are kind of in their male plumage feeding the young, besides the female also being at the nest. The second thing which is intriguing here, then this young here is actually a cuckoo. It's not the own young, so it's not the superb fairy wren species. And then when you actually go even deeper and look at the painting, no, it wasn't done by John Gould, but it was done by his wife. So Elizabeth Gould was the one doing this, really, at least the sketch for this very famous painting. So yeah, it's always worth to go back and check the sources, because here, I mean, it's this classic case of where, John Gould gets the fame, but actually it was his wife that should get the fame for this first illustration of cooperative breeding in birds. Now, it's not only in birds, but it's also happening in insects, in fish, in mammals and humans. So it's really widespread. And so what's going on? Why are actually animals doing this? And this is really kind of one of the questions I try to answer, although I'm not really fully working on cooperative breeding, as you might see later on in the talk. So I'll just give you a brief outline of the talk so that you see what I'm going to tell you. So I first give you a brief general background on cooperation. It's quite a messy field with a lot of different definitions. I will then go into cooperative breeding and actually take some step backs and talk about the definition of this behavior and the pitfalls that are enclosed to that. We'll then present you the stepping stone model for the evolution of cooperative breeding. You might have seen some of these pieces already. This is not really new. And also tell you why then, once we have knowing that family living is really critical for cooperative breeding, telling you why this is actually really valuable and why species do it then. And then I swing over to something more recent. Really, this is extending this family living parental association to cognitive evolution, and show you that it really things matter there as well. And then I summarize what I just told you today. So one other approach to the question really is, why should we bother about these questions? Well, if we think about ourselves, I mean, we are a family living cooperative species with extensive parental care, and we have really massive brains. And so it's really interesting to know how we got there, but there's some trouble with that, right? And traditionally, we have been living in families that live in bands and we breed cooperatively. And it has then been proposed that cooperative breeding is really pivotal for the evolution of hypercooperation and language. The reason for that is that cooperation kind of facilitates a sharing mindset. So if you give away food, you also can give away information and so on. And this then facilitates language. Now, the trouble really is that if we go out there and look at all the primates, they are really very different. And so converging cases are really highly valuable. That's where the birds I study come in. Now, if we try kind of studying this, I mean, there's really something we should keep in mind. I mean, these are really big questions, and Tinbergen pointed out that we actually can answer these questions on different levels. So we either can take an approximate or an ultimate view, and we can then take a dynamic or static view on this. And so we can study either the ontogeny, the mechanisms, the phylogeny, or the functions of behaviors. Evolution is tying these four questions really together at these four levels. But if we talk about it, it's really important to keep in mind which level we actually talk about. Okay, so let's come back to cooperation. Now, I really tell you cooperative breeding is puzzling, right? However, if you go out in nature and take a really good look, it's not only about competition out there, it's a lot about cooperation. I mean, cells cooperate to form actually cells. They then cooperate to form multicellular organisms like in this Volvox. We see individuals that cooperate to deal with parasites or access and defend resources. And as such, is cooperation actually leading to higher levels of biological complexity, so both in terms of individuals, but also of societies, like our human society. Now, as mentioned, cooperation is really a quite complicated field when it comes to the terms, so I provide you with some very basic definitions. Now, when individuals help each other, this means this is something that increases the direct fitness of the recipient. So we look here at the recipient side. If this help is happening among individuals of the same species, it's called cooperation. And if it's happening among individuals of different species, it's called mutualism. Now I'm going to focus on cooperation today. But for those of you really interested in kind of the more framework around it, I cannot show you a lot of things. I really recommend you to have a look at the Lehmann and Keller paper or this Schary and Bergmüller paper for cooperation, whereas the Bronstein review is really good on mutualism. Now, how can something like that evolve? I mean, it's apparently selfless, helping, right? I mean, already Darwin actually scratched his head above the social insects he was watching in his garden, but he couldn't figure it out. So it took biologists basically over 100 years to come up with two solutions to this. So the first solution is indirect fitness benefits, meaning kin selection. So relative individuals help other relatives, and given their shared ancestry, they also share genes. So if I help my brother, I basically also spread my own genes that way. The other route goes via direct fitness benefits. And there's several models that have been proposed. So one famous one by Trivers is reciprocity. So I scratch your back and you scratch my back. Or another one that has not received much attention is the interdependence idea of Roberts. I cannot really elaborate much on this, but it's basically friendship, right? So if you build up friendship between individuals, you have really a benefit of having your friend around. So you do then a lot of things, which basically benefit you as well, because you have a friend around that then also can help you. Now, really, this widespread form that is really costly is cooperative breeding. And this is really something I think we should look at a little bit more carefully. I know there have been many, many studies, but still, I think zooming in helps a little bit to try to get to the grasp of this behavior. So with that, I would already like to come to the second part and really try to define this behavior for you, just show you how tricky this is. Now, if we think about cooperative breeding, you're really the first one that mentioned it in the literature and really tried to define it was Sketch. I mean, he was working in Central America. Actually, he was working, it was in the banana companies. I don't remember in which one. So he, as his hobby, he watched birds. And he realized there's many species where there's more than the two parents actually attending a nest. And so he simply defined cooperative breeding as nestlings that are attended by individuals other than the two parents. It took them many, many years. Coburn, in his really big annual review he published in '89, he said that, okay, it's more than two individuals that combine to rear a single brood of young. We have, for example, Cornwall is in his Nature paper on can I say? No, I can't forget about it. So, you know, he basically said that individuals that forego own reproduction to help others, that's cooperative breeding. We have done something similar by Lucas and Clapton-Brock in their paper on mammals, where they say, okay, females are assisted in protecting and feeding their offspring by non-breeding helpers. So, I mean, this is also here, this element of non-breeding. Or then Cornwall is in another one, he just adds on, well, it has to be at least in 10% of nests or more. So all fine, but there's a lot of problems with this, and I would like to go through this. Okay, no, before I do that, just to show you from the Coburn 2020 review paper on the topic, how he argues, and this might really help. So he basically, you know, is thinking of an increase in caretakers. So where you have species that don't provide parental care. Well, wrong. I think brood parasites also receive parental care, but not from their own species. We have the species which uniparental care. I mean, this can be female only, male only, depending on most species in birds. Actually, 80% provide biparental care, and we have the 10 to potentially 15% of species where there's more than 2 caretakers. And he also speaks about adults. Now, the problem with this is really what doesn't count as help. Why do it need to be more than 2 adults? I mean, adults, you know, why only adults? And why do these individuals have to forego their own reproduction? I mean, how widespread should it be in the population? What about variation across populations? And yeah, does this all need to be adaptive? So I just show you now a few examples to kind of try to get to the grasp of the problem of definition. Now, there's a South American species in the Funariids, that's the brown cachalot. They build really big stick nests, and offspring actually help their parents in nest construction. You can here see there's like 3 birds hanging around the nest. The species, however, does not breed cooperatively thereafter. Is this yes or no? I cannot tell you. I will tell you afterwards. Another odd case is the Australian swiftlet. They lay 1 egg, and when the nestling is big enough, the female lays another egg, and then you basically have the nestling of the first brood incubating the eggs of the second brood. Definitely not an adult. I would say that's cooperative breeding, right? If you then go to the species where the helpers actually reproduce themselves, so there are breeders, we have, for example, the Danok or the Amy. I mean, what's happening here is that you have multiple adults at times combining in different combinations, and then not everyone basically gets to reproduce or has eggs in the same nest, but still contributes to raising the young. Or in the Amy, you have a multiple pairs team up. The females basically start laying eggs, they destroy the eggs, and at some point they don't really have sorted it, and then they start laying eggs and incubate them. But this means that then a lot of the females or the males within an attempt do not actually contribute. Actually, genetically, they only contribute in terms of feeding the young. Another interesting one, blue tits in Europe, well studied, mostly 2 parents. In rare cases, you get a 3rd one appearing at the nest and feeding once or twice. Is this cooperative breeding? I don't think so. Because if you go then out and start looking in the literature, or as I saw in the field together with Toshi Suzuki in Japan, when we were studying Japanese tits, yeah, we suddenly had a Japanese tit popping up at the woodpecker nest feeding the young. I mean, right, so here you can see a young woodpecker sticking the head out, having a picture inside. You see these are woodpecker youngs. These are not gray titya or Japanese titya. Definitely not cooperative breeding. I mean, this is an accident, right? Or let's talk about Australian magpies. This in some populations, they're cooperative breeders, in others they are not. How do we deal with this? So what I would like to argue is really it matters really all type of help. It's not only about adults. It doesn't matter if it's juveniles or even nestlings, they help. I mean, the more than 2 adults, I think it's just a bird bias. I mean, it should be just more of the say of one sex that contributes. I mean, we haven't yet discovered a cooperative breeder in birds with uniparental care, but there's sure in other lineages systems out there where it goes like that. How widespread does it need to be? I mean, just think of the blue tit example or the Japanese tit. I think this guess of Coburn that it should be more than 10% makes kind of sense, because you need really to be able to study this behavior. And if it's too infrequent, it's something, yes, but it's not really regular cooperative breeding. I mean, the population variation really shows that we should use population-based data and not just put everything in one bag for a species. And then, yeah, I think the most tricky one is basically to show an adaptive value of all of these things above. And so what I'm doing is with Andy Russell. We have not yet really progressed first much, but what we think is really a potential definition of cooperative breeding should really look at the phenomena and not the consequences. So basically, we think that if a conspecific non-parent engages in parental care behaviors in at least 10% of reproductive events within a population, then a species should be labeled as cooperative breeder. Now, sure, you might disagree, whatever, but I think that's what I come to when I think about the topic and think this provides at least a good starting point to then think about the problem again. Now, why do we really need to bother about the definition? I mean, there's a lot of high impact comparative studies out there in birds, and many of them actually rely on Coburn's 2006 list of cooperative breeders. So this can include single natural history observations of a species somewhere in Africa. Yes, we don't know what actually then all the population is doing. The other thing is it's binary. You see later on why I think this is a critical point. And the other thing really is if things are not listed as cooperative breeder, it's classified as non-cooperative breeder. That's actually most of the species, even though they are potentially not even studied. And so basically what I would like to argue is that so far the used bird data are quite noisy and they mix from different populations. And obviously all of these would need amending. We don't know if it does change the big picture if we do so, but I still think it would be a fair deal to do so. Okay, now basically I'm now not doing what I told you to do, because this is just a very recent thinking I've been doing together with Andy Russell. So I show you now results from a comparative study where we were exactly doing the mistakes, or some of them listed above. So don't point the finger at me, I'm aware of that. Now, why is actually our birds really cool to do this? I mean, besides it's really widespread, there's a lot of long-term studies in birds that have especially been looking at cooperative breeding. So it's not only these acorn woodpeckers, there's many, many more. Also, some of you in the audience contribute to this. And so what we have learned is that in most cases, it's kin selection. In some cases, it's not, but in most it is. So meaning it's about offspring that hang around with the parents into the next breeding season and feed younger siblings for one or the other reason. Now, if we then try to understand what's happening, I mean, it would really be cool to have a time machine to go back in time and kind of look at the ancestors of this kind of non-cooperative breeders. I mean, physical time machines are not yet invented, but there is something called biological time machines, and that's phylogenies. So basically, by understanding how species are related with each other in the big picture of like here, all birds, we can use statistical tools to start understanding why some species, like the acorn woodpecker, are a cooperative breeder, and why others, like the European grey tits, are a non-cooperative breeders. Now, what does this study show this? They showed two things. I mean, the first thing, were mainly the older studies, so to speak, they showed it is associated with stable environments. And the argument there has been, okay, the kids don't have anywhere to go. It's in their best interest just to stick around with the parents and help at the nest, a best of a bad job, so to speak. Now, more recently, and this is mainly Austin Rubenstein has been pushing this idea, and this is really also quite an exciting one. It's like, oh no, hang on, this has to do with variable environments. Because if you try breeding on your own in a variable environment in a bad year, you fail. And so what you best do is actually you better hang out with the parents and help them to buffer out the risk of reproductive failure in bad years, particularly. Now, as you can see, these are conflicting findings, and I would like to argue that this is because of the binary splitting into non-cooperative and cooperative breeding. There's one thing that all these studies overlook, and this comes down to the categorization. So this species here, as I told you, is mostly in families. However, there's also families on this side. And so what I've been arguing now for quite a while is that basically we should split these non-cooperative breeders into two different types of systems, mainly the non-family living species where the kids go after independence. Sure, they stay a little bit, but then they go and don't further interact with parents. Or we have the family living species. Offspring remain with the parents beyond the independence, but then they do not breed cooperatively. Or we have indeed the cooperative breeders that often stay with the parents to help at the nest. And now keep in mind what I told you before with the definition. So this is only a certain subset of cooperative breeding species. But it's the majority of them doing this. Okay, now if we split up species this way, we can ask two types of questions. The first question is, what are the phylogenetic transitions? So how do these systems change within the phylogenetic tree of birds? And the second question then is more specifically like, okay, what's associated with the guys that live in families, basically the transition from here to here, and what's associated with the transition to cooperative breeding? Now, to answer the first question, we were combining species, not population data of 3,000 species, and simply looking how these systems evolve. So we did ancestral state reconstruction, and we did find that in birds, we mostly start with non-family living species. They then evolve into family living species, which in turn evolve into cooperative breeders, and then back again. Some of the species can lose immediately their family living, to go back to the non-family living state. However, the transition from non-family living to cooperative breeding is utterly rare. So this shows you basically evidence for the stepping stone model of cooperative breeding. And it also shows you that social evolution in birds is highly fluid. This is not always something that is fixed and set in stone. Now, knowing this, can we solve the conundrum over the different factors that matter? So we combined this social data with basic ecoclimatic and life history data and put this into MCMC-GLM and found the following. So basically, we could show that the transition from non-family living to family living is associated with birds being bigger, being more long-lived, living more sedentary and more productive environments, while the transition to more variable environments is associated with cooperative breeding. Well, no, so the transition to cooperative breeding is associated with more variable environments. Sorry, I've been speaking to too many people today already. So as you can see, everybody basically from this old studies got it right, but they didn't get really all the details right. And so therefore they really could not match up these different pieces. Now, the reason why it's really important to consider family living as a social system of its own right, I just illustrate you here with these curves. So what traditional studies do is they look at non-cooperative and cooperative breeders. And if we do this with our data, we basically sum up the lines, the orange line and the green line. So we get this purple line. If you compare here statistically, it's mostly flat. And so also here, if you do this for, that's rainfall variability, if you do it for growing season length, we basically see the same effect. So because the non-family living and the family living species really have opposing responses to various ecoclimatic and other factors, if you merge them together, you basically miss out the difference there is. So this really shows you also statistically, not only biologically, that if you do not consider them as a separate social system, you set out the results there are, which is a pity, right? Now, the problem really is that if you bin something that is not binary, you might not see the big picture. But the philosophical problem we have here is how do we figure out natural categories when it comes, for example, to sociality? Using help, sure, present help is definitely something that might help to overcome part of the issue, but it won't overcome the issue of separating family and non-family living species. And so what it basically requires really is a natural history knowledge. And I know there's a lot of people out there that like to do large-scale phylogenetic work, but I'm afraid they don't have a really in-depth knowledge of natural history. And so they miss out certain pieces. And all the risk is really, I think we like to take the low-hanging grapes, including me. So we basically utilize what's out there without actually going back to critically rethink, is this actually against my natural history knowledge meaningful? So I can't give you really a solution here how to do this in a good way, but this is really something where we as a field need to go back and think critically. Now, I can also now show you why biologically I think family living in birds at least is really something to bother about. If you look at the sheer numbers of bird species in the set of the 3,000 species we have, is actually 1/3 of species is family living, but only about 15% of them are cooperative breeders. So it's very widespread. So what's then the benefit of this? I mean, what's the adaptive value? This I would like to show you in the next part, which I then immediately link into my more recent work on cognitive evolution. So I've been studying Siberian jays since my PhD, and really what I found is that, okay, if we take out cooperative breeding from the equation, we really can learn a lot about the sociality underlying. Now, just a brief background introduction to the system. It's a family living non-cooperative breeding corvid. The population was started in 1953. It's located in Swedish Lapland, 80 kilometers south of Arctic Circle. So think of Anchorage in the US, far north. My PhD advisor, Jan Ekman, started the scientific work in 1989, and then I took over gradually and practically and everything by latest 2012. And currently we have 90 groups which we followed, and the number here is cranked up to 2,300 or 400 by now. So we have really a lot of individual data. So why do I hang on to this system and work with it? First reason, the species is really handy in all sorts of respects. So that it's not shy species. They are not timid when it comes to humans, and some individuals with some assistance, that's one of my former master students, they land on your hand without you having the need to train the birds. I mean, this is really great, right? Now, the other reason why I keep on working with the system has really to do with the social structure. We have groups that are centered around the breeding pair. When they breed successfully, they have own offspring around for 4 years, don't help. And then we have also groups that include these non-breeders, which are non-kin, so like this guy here. And these are the subordinate siblings within each brood. They are kicked out by the dominant siblings. They disperse and mostly join groups where there's no other kin around, or kin juveniles at least, and then they are there. And this non-kin really allow us to identify the specific benefits of family living. It's a natural setup. And using this, we could really show that family living is about nepotism. So, you treat your offspring and your relatives preferentially compared to unrelated individuals. So one situation here we looked at is exposure to predators, and jays are mainly killed by hawks and owls. If you put models there and look how long do breeders mob, you see that the breeders, when they're together with own offspring, mob much longer than when they're together with juveniles that are not their own. And sure, this benefit then actually translates into higher survival, at least during some winters, not all. And these benefits are found also in many, many other things. So you name vigilance, alarm calls, and so on. Now, so what this shows is really that family living provides a safe haven to offspring where they get predator protection, they get access to food. And on the long run, if we then look at the reproductive value, so this means this is the anticipated reproductive output of kin and non-kin, we see that the kin always are above non-kin. So this is really beneficial for everyone in the family, right? There's just a problem with that. And you cannot take your parents with you when you go to breed. But there's another thing you can take with you, and this is basically skills or the knowledge you learn while you're together with your parents. This has been proposed in the 70s and 80s, but hasn't really taken up. And so we tested these ideas in the jays. So what we did is we built this type of feeder. You have simply to lift the lid, and here under the pink is some sausage. They love sausage, do everything for sausage. We did this with breeders in the previous year mostly, so the juveniles that are born into these groups or join the group as non-kin, they don't know the deal. So it's a novel task for them. And we did this with 38 juveniles in 24 groups, allowing us really to study what's going on. Sorry. Okay, we found that 3 things really matter. Some more, but the 3 key things are here. So the more individuals in the group that know how to solve the task, the quicker you'll learn the task. So this is basically the lower the better. This is the latency until you can solve the task. It's also, if you're kin, you solve the task much, much faster. So it's not only about demonstrators, but it's access to tolerant demonstrators. Parents always are. Non-kin don't have this advantage. And then as a third dimension, it's also how interesting these juveniles are in the task. So those with a high feeder inspection rate, they solve the task much, much faster. It's quite interesting. So this shows that social learning in Siberian jays really is a multidimensional thing. It's not only one thing that matters, but multiple pieces put together. Now, it's all artificial. It's a color board. Does this matter for real life? And the astonishing thing is, yes, it does. So we waited from 2014 when we did these experiments until last year when I started analyzing the data, looking at the downstream survival. Now, if we separate the fast and the slower learners here, we see that those that learn fast have much longer long-term survival than the slow learners. And this is also then happening if we look at if they become breeder or not. So the guys that become breeder, sure, they have a much longer average survival. Yeah, most are still alive. Whereas those that didn't make it, they died. And what this is reflecting is basically that this is just the age when individuals become breeder. That is the y-axis misses, and sorry for that. Is that the average age of them is about 18 months. So by 28 months, most individuals are actually breeder. And so this is actually reflected here. So anything that makes you live long enough makes you become a breeder. And so this fast learning here is one of these things. Still quite puzzling, right? I agree. What's going on? Now, what's going on is basically getting back to the factors that matter. So if you are curious, you have role models around that can tell you something and you have access to them, you basically learn what matters. And the thing that matters in Siberian jay is you have to know this is bad news. This is a goshawk. The goshawk kills about 65 to 70% of individuals. 95% of individuals that die because of predation. The puzzling thing is that juveniles don't know this. So if you put them a predator model there, they don't respond. However, they realize that this is bad news when they can observe all the group members mobbing predators. So like here, this hawk owl. So we use this as an experimental setup where we expose different groups to either goshawks, other predator models, or no predator model at all. So all the 24 juveniles that saw the goshawk model being mobbed survived the first winter of life. And this is no mistake. I really double-checked this data so many times. They all made it. If you see other predators being mobbed or no, it doesn't matter. You still have your average mortality of 28% during the first winter of life. And this advantage is still visible when we look at them becoming breeder. So this really shows how adaptive and beneficial social learning is, and that social learning is a key function of family living. Now, just to wrap you up this part of the talk, I basically showed you that family living provides a safe haven with predator protection, access to food, and so on. But you also have these learning opportunities that can boost your fitness and make you a competent breeder, so to speak. And so one could easily argue like, okay, the more of these opportunities you have over the long time, you should really have a larger brain, or you should be more clever. And this is something which we found in a very small subset of species. Where we looked at this, we basically find that the species where the offspring stay longer, they have a larger brain. Now, this isn't really the full picture, and that's where just a recent analysis comes in. There's something else that matters even more. Now, To explain you this, I really would like to explain you why it's puzzling and interesting to study these brains. I mean, they're really puzzling for two reasons. Brains, you know, as a young bird born, come largely empty. You have some few things you can do already, but most things you have to learn. And they're terribly costly. So if you look basically at the curves where you get a benefit from having a large brain, the green one, and compare that to the costs. And the costs of development, this is really unusual, are actually even higher than of maintenance. So it's really an old tissue brain. You have to be really already way down your development before you actually can reap the benefit of having a large brain. So what overcomes this bootstrapping problem then? And the answer is really simple. You have your parents to pay for it. And birds are really a good set of species to look at this, because when it comes to parenting and parental effort, there's two different strategies. So we have precocial birds. Parents lay big eggs. Out of the eggs come these fluffy young ducklings or any other chicken type of bird. They can immediately run around, basically care for their own. The parents sure are needed for one or the other thing, but mostly to get the ducklings to their own business. Same aged songbird looks like this. They are naked. They are highly dependent on parents for everything. So, you know, this is a very different strategy. And this really has a massive impact on brain size. So, as mentioned, the precocial birds, you know, these species with large clutches, large eggs, they end up with small brains. Whereas the altricial birds, sure, they lay much smaller clutches and smaller eggs, but then there's this massive period of parents putting in energy into the young in the nest after they leave the nest. I mean, in New Caledonian crow, one of the most clever bird species, for up to a year. And so if you have that energy input into your brain, then you actually end up with a large brain. Now, just to show you how this hangs together, I mean, this is a path analysis showing these results. I mean, basically, it's really, if you're a species with a large body mass, sure, you have a larger brain, but if you then are especially an altricial one, where you have all these benefits, you end up, you know, you are fed more and so on. So you end up with really these big brains. So think of corvids, parrots, and so on. I mean, you know, these bird species with massive brains, they're really fed for quite a while. Okay, if we then put that on the map and compare it across species, you see that and put up slopes between the body size and the brain size, both locked, you basically see that the curve of the slopes really get a dip to be more shallow. And this is always concurring with the end of parental provisioning. In ecto terms, it's basically only eggs, tiny eggs. In precocial birds, it's big eggs, but then it stops. And in the altricial birds and mammals, you know, there's a lot of energy they put in. So this is really, parental provisioning is the key thing. So basically, this shows us that we have been barking at the wrong tree when it comes to cognitive evolution. And the bootstrap model really puts the finger on the weak point of previous work. Now, interestingly, what matters are then the cognitive adaptations that enable the parents to be a successful parent. The question then really is, and this is something we don't yet have the answer, is, are then different cognitive adaptation required to actually build and support this large thing and be a successful parent, or are they kind of coinciding? And the bootstrapping model really can, as I showed you, explain the differences across lineages in brain size. And key thing really, it's parental care or extended parental care and parental provisioning that matters. So just to summarize this part of the talk, I showed you that the stepping stone model for evolution matters for cooperative breeding. It resolves the conflicting findings of the stable and the variable environments. Now, just as a bracket, cooperative breeding is an umbrella term. So, you know, we have Dustin starlings here. We have the hornbills. Very different, you know, these are the stable environment guys. These are the environmental variability guys. So we kind of can explain this, and obviously it seems that these guys here still have a kind of the factors that matter for family living, but then become cooperative breeder. However, explaining something like the ANI is not possible with our stepping stone model. We need to think more. Species like the long-tailed tits with live in kin neighborhood and you have redirected health, they can be partly explained by it, but also we need to do some more thinking there. I also showed you that family living is a safe haven. And if we take a really meta view now and take a step back, I mean, it has been argued since Hamilton, the kin cooperation is about population viscosity. However, I think we need to argue, at least for quite a lot of cooperative breeders, that it's about delayed family dissolution. So we have to look at all the sides of the coin. I also showed you that family living affects cognition and all the key traits, and that parental provisioning is actually important for cognitive evolution. So parental care and parental provisioning is probably the most important social system in general, and not only in humans. So yeah, with that, I would like to bring you back this picture. And basically, studying birds, yes, helps us to also understand why we humans are such in a unique position among species. And with that, I would like to acknowledge a lot of colleagues and students and postdocs that helped me all to do this work, and obviously also various funding bodies that gave their money to do this. And I would like to take you also, I have to thank you for your attention, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Michael, for such an interesting talk. So if anyone has a question, please type a question mark in the chat system, and then when I will then call you according to who appears first. And when I call you, please just introduce yourself, where your name, the institution you're from, so that the rest of the community can get to know you. Okay, so we already have a few questions. Carsten?
Yes, I'm Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strasbourg, studying social evolution in mammals. Thank you, Michael, for a very fascinating talk. Of course, lots of information and very interesting. I would like to come back to your 2017 PLOS biology paper that you very quickly, it's a big paper, you showed very quickly in 1 or 2 slides, the transition from non-family living to family living. Then your slide, you had different factors, and maybe you can emphasize on this, and also if you think there's a difference between cause and effect. You said from non-family living to family living, and I have the advantage I can look here on the YouTube slides, I can still see it. It's said to be longevity, sedentariness, mild and productive environments are the factors leading to family living. Can you explain this a little bit more, and especially longevity? Is it a cause or an effect of family living, for example?
Okay, so I mean, you know, the cause and effect discussion, I think, is a very difficult one, because at the end of the day, it's coevolution. So what kind of starts a cascading process of a species to become more long-lived, and there have therefore different options? I cannot really tell you. I mean, you know, this is yeah, a difficult question. Now, what these factors all do on a ontogenetic perspective from parents providing care to offspring is that it allows you as a parent to sustain extended feeding of young. You know, so if you are long-lived, you basically produce smaller clutches, you have fewer offspring, and if you then are in this position and you are in an environment where you actually can provide offspring prolonged with food and any other benefit, you can then actually do it. In highly variable environments, you know, this is more difficult. Now, no, the jays, sure, they live in terribly, you know, variable environments in the Arctic, you know, far north. However, what they do is they store food. So their environment is actually highly predictable. And, you know, so they have a constant access to food because they do that.
So how did you in your study, if I can ask this, how did you in your study quantify whether an environment was mild and productive?
Okay, so what we did, we used quite a lot of different environmental parameters. So, you know, including rainfall, temperature, variability indexes, but also net primary productivity. And then so we PCA'd everything and got several PCs out that, you know, were then loadings of things that are, you know, basically you have a prolonged growing seasons, not only encaptured by long NTP periods, you know, with net primary production being, you know, happening most of the year, but also, you know, having a lot of rainfall and so on. These environments obviously are the more productive. Now, I mentioned that the long-hanging grapes or the low-hanging grapes, and the problem really is that sure, we can do these types of things. I also did, but still it's shortcuts and proxies for things which we not really measure. So, we kind of put on top things and kind of extract something that reflects or is similar to things as productivity. It's not actual productivity, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carsten. Next, we have Adriana.
Hi, thanks, Michael, for such a nice talk. I'm Adriana Maldonado from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. My question is about your first part of the talk, where you were going over the definition of cooperation, which I really liked, that you took all these papers and try to make a single definition. I think we really need that. But I was curious on why did we set up on the 10%? Where did this like a magic number? Where did it come from? I didn't understand the reasoning behind that.
Okay, so I think the reason behind this has to be, if we have something called cooperative breeding in a population, we have to be able to study it. And so, for most people in systems, I know they study 30 whatever pairs of something. And if you do this for a good number of years, if you have 10% of these events then having a cooperation involved, you can actually study. You get numbers out where you can do statistics, you can look at things. So I know this number is arbitrary, but the problem really is highlighted by the blue tit and the Japanese tit. Where does the breaking point need to be to separate out the accidents from the occasional, from those that actually, are regular cooperative breeders? And I mean, one solution would be to have the percentage of help that is provided, in average per whatever, in a population per nest. You name it, however you calculate it. It would solve it partly, but still, I don't think it would fully sort it because, we, in a lot of cases, we don't have this data. And what it also doesn't sort, is the non-binary splitting of social systems. So family living, you cannot define by percentage of help. So, this is really something I think which needs more thinking. And this is a pragmatic number. If you go and study something, if you have 10% in a population doing it, I think you can actually study it. If it's lower, it's interesting, but you cannot do anything with it. So it's maybe more from the point of view, it being studyable, but not necessarily it being the biological key thing that, we should focus on. So it's, it's really difficult. And I'm sorry, I cannot give you a conclusive answer here.
No, I think that's a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Next on the line, we have Zuleima.
Yes, hi, Zuleima Tang Martinez, retired from the University of Missouri in St. Louis in the US. And I have a couple of questions. I thought your talk was really, really interesting and parallels a lot of the things that I used to do while I was still teaching. But a couple, just to be clear in my own mind, you talk about stable environments, and I have tended to think in terms of that hypothesis as to why offspring stay more as an issue of saturated environments. And I'm wondering if you distinguish between stable and saturated, because you could have a stable environment that still has, for example, areas where you could set up new territories, versus the way that I tend to think about saturated environments is a situation where all possible territorial sites are taken, and therefore the offspring that stay because they can't find their own territory and they're sort of waiting their chance. And then the second question I have is, I think the data you presented about the benefits of kin and of being in groups, but especially of kin, was super interesting. But I'm also wondering if you looked at any potential costs of having birds stay and having a larger family group in terms of being either more conspicuous to predators or competition among the birds that stay, or among helpers for that matter. I think it applies both for the staying and the helping. So those are my two questions.
Okay, so first answer is, okay, I mean, habitat saturation has been the big thing, and it has been argued a lot, but it's really a tricky one. Basically, if you go out and look critically, most species have some sort of dispersal constraint due to some sort of, saturation of whatever element in their environment. But still, there's only a certain subset of species which can decide to remain with the parents, or the parents can allow kids to stay. So I think what's really missing out from the equation is life history theory, because if you are medium to long lived, I mean, we did a comparative study of that quite a while ago, and when you look at the reproductive benefit of you starting breeding in the first, second, third, and so on year, there's really a striking shift from short-lived species where you should start breeding in your first lived. If you're medium and long lived, you shouldn't do that. And the reason is that, you need skills, you need all your things together to be able to be a successful breeder. If you start in your first year, it's very costly. And this is now independent of, habitat variability, as we have in dust and starlings. I mean, there it's even more pronounced, but I think every species basically this medium to long lived faces this problem. So the best thing you can do is wait. And if you then can wait with your parents, it's even additionally beneficial because you can learn all these things. You're together with kin. So I don't really think that the habitat saturation discussion might be putting the finger on the right thing. I think it's a side effect of something else, but yeah. Now, the second question regarding the costs of having kin and other group members around, I have been looking into this quite a bit in a study where we were looking at mortality of 600 radio-tagged individuals, and I could not find any cost in terms of survival on male or female breeders. There is a tiny, tiny thing happening with male breeders in larger groups to have a little bit lower survival, but not statistically significant. With reproductive effort, we could only detect the negative signal on nesting condition if you had more non-kin in the group, but not of kin. So it seems to be kind of cost neutral, but I cannot give you my final word for that because we have only looked in some aspects, but not everything.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Zulema. I don't want to skip. I'm not sure, Josh, did you have a question?
No, I was just echoing Anthony's sentiment. I agree very much with it.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then we have another question from Carson.
Yeah, as I see there's a little bit of time, I would, before I come to my question, come to the comment from Anthony that what he emphasizes how important it is that you mentioned that good life history data is very important. And my comment was just to emphasize this data should also be published. Sometimes people, and all of us, we are people that know a lot about life history, but sometimes we have opinions or knowledge which is not that supported by data. And sometimes it comes, okay, my species is like this and this and this, and then I build up this hypothesis, and 10 years later, you change it a little bit. And I think it's always very important to really publish life history data that one can check this.
Well, may I just say another thing, Carsten? I think it's absolutely fundamental. We have to get to some sort of protocol, every one of us working on wild animals, to have a basic protocol of how we report data and that we have a public repository for that. Because, we lose basically this basic life history and the natural history data, and they are really vital. I mean, we need them. So we need to do something about this.
Exactly. And some introductions of papers, they're based on life history knowledge, which is not, you cannot track it. It's just made to fit their data and hypothesis to sell it, unfortunately. So my question was, I mean, you very nicely pointed out these problems of categorizing species into one or the other category, when there might be actually 3 categories, like non-family living, family living, cooperative breeding. And then you mentioned, and maybe I missed it, but maybe you can emphasize more on this, the cooperative breeding in birds. You might have with or without breeders. I mean, in mammals, we clearly distinguish between cooperative breeding and communal breeding and see there's something totally different. And I know Rubenstein also did this with the shrimps, but it seems for you in the birds, it's not such a big difference between cooperative breeding with non-breeding habitats at the nest and communal breeding, how we call it in mammalogy, where there are breeders helping each other.
So that's a very good point. And I couldn't show everything I'm doing with Andy on this. But there's definitely different elements and components, vectors, so to speak, that have to come out. And I mean, one is the spatial location of young. And this I don't think has to do anything with cooperative breeding, because there is communal species where, young are in the same place, but mothers still only care for their own young. And you have the, species like the Amy, where you have basically young from multiple breeding pairs in the same nest, and everyone contributes, which is cooperative breeding. So, this is a rearing system. It's not a spatial system that tells you how the offspring are distributed spatially. I'm not sure if I could answer your question.
I'm not sure. I think if I try to make this, to understand this with my little brain, maybe one difference is with the birds, it's more centralized on one nest than in mammals, where it might be like when you compare zebra mongooses, where every female has its own burrow. Well, that's not even true, I believe. Sometimes it's partly they share burrow systems. Yeah. I don't know. I have to think about it.
Yeah, but the question of cooperative breeding really is, so do you provide any parental care elements to offspring that are not your own? And then it doesn't matter how the offspring are distributed. You can do this outside the nest, in the nest. It's not really the deal then, right? How the young are spatially distributed.
Yeah, I mean, I think in mammalogy, the main argument is the costs to help are much lower when you breed yourself in communally breeding species than in cooperatively breeding species, where for whatever reason you cannot breed yourself at the moment. So it's more difficult. They claim it's more difficult to explain cooperative breeding than communal breeding.
Okay, I have to think more on this, but so it's, yeah.
Okay, our next question is from Eduardo.
Thank you, Michael. I definitely want to follow up with you once I'm in the field and settled. So I'm very, very dispersed. So I'm not even sure I can phrase my question properly, but I'm hoping you can comment on some thoughts that I'm having as I was trying to listen to the presentation and the discussion while trying to refresh my mind on a couple of papers that I read in detail a few years ago, and then I was part of a paper that we published on this topic. So, and you may or may not be familiar with the work that both Thornton and McAuliffe published. So 5 or 6 years ago, McAuliffe was a postdoc here at Yale, and that's how I met her. And we started talking about what was at the time people were pushing for the cooperative breeding hypothesis to explain the evolution of brain size in humans, and Carol Van Schaik and Burkhardt. And so I ran into McAuliffe, and I don't know if I just want to, in case people want to check, can I quickly share? Do I have access to share? Yes. So they had just published this, Alex Thornton and McAuliffe, a cognitive consequence of cooperative breeding, critical appraisal. And so I just met Katie and we talked. And the reason I bring this up is because it's fascinating. You have really published a lot, like Kirsten said. I mean, and emphasizing and through your talk, you really were agreeing a lot on the need to be very explicit, detailed about the quality of the data. And so I became familiar with the work, and then because the cooperative breeding hypothesis was also being examined or used to explain the presumed increase in brain size in primates, I ended up being a co-author on something for which I didn't know a thing about cognition, but I did know a thing or two about the data on primates. So that was my contribution, and together with Paul Garber, who has studied callitrichids for some 30 years, we kind of provided our expertise to Alex and Katie in trying to evaluate, I mean, how strong was the cooperative breeding hypothesis to relate brain size, cooperative breeding, humans, and this and that. So can you help me? My recollection, one of the things that we did is that some of the arguments were based on data from capuchins, genus Cebus, and callitrichids. And again, because Paul Garber has studied callitrichids for such a long time, callitrichids are a little bit of the poster boy, girl, whatever you want to call it, for cooperative breeding, but they're as dumb as they can be in terms of primates when people evaluate them in the lab. And then capuchins on the other side, which again, the story without looking at the data, the way you do it, and we like doing it for the capuchins, is that they are the smartest, the larger brains, no cooperative breeding at all. So our contribution to that dialogue was, well, we can check the data for capuchins and callitrichids, and for our contribution, and then they also had data on the corvids. So can you help me remember what's going on with the view that McAuliffe and Thornton have on this topic vis-a-vis what you're sharing with us? And this is what I think, I mean, this is about ideas, this is not about people. So what's your take on their view, then tangentially informed by Garber's and mine, on how capuchins and callitrichids could provide data or not in support of the hypothesis?
I cannot give you a scientific answer here because, I was at the time when this debate happened, was at the Anthropological Institute in Zurich. And so I know just the emotional side of Carl and Judith being terribly upset about Alex Thornton, I think for good reasons. So when it comes to the scientific argument, I will need to go back and rethink it and tell you why I think they were emotionally upset for good reasons. But Alex has a history of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So, I think, this is probably not so justified, the critic all over it's done. And to be giving you a scientifically informed information kind of comment, I really would need to go back and read it and rethink also with what I showed you.
I appreciate that, and that's why I said it.
I mean,
that's how I feel as well. I don't know.
What
I would have to look at the data.
Tell you is, so if you single-handed pick species as examples for having a big or small brain, and then put a single dot on it and say like, okay, hang on, corvids are non-cooperative breeders but have massive brains, and these callies which are, have not so big brains and they're cooperative breeders compared to the capuchins which are not. It's really comparing pears with apples, I think. So it is within a lineage with a specific life history niche where a factor like cooperative breeding enables you to crank up things, or parental provisioning in case of the birds. Whereas if you start comparing across lineages where things are not really comparable, it's not comparable. So I think this is the only answer I would like to give you to this right now. I mean, if you're interested in discussing this with me, I can read the papers once more and take a discussion once you're maybe back from Formosa. And
let's do it. No, I mean, I totally hear you and I agree. And Tony's here with us as well, and he has much more experience on phylogenetic analysis. That's where, I mean, now I'm just commenting on the conversation you and I had yesterday. That's where we ought to be extremely careful when we start. I mean, it's fascinating for those of us interested in parenting to see what we're learning from people studying frogs and fish and birds and primates, but without losing sight that so much of what has been said for primates with regards to this, I mean, and again, it's really just choosing what's out there. And sometimes I mean, all those lines relating brain size with your outcome of choice, it's a little bit of the kinds of some of us feel like the data sets that are being chosen, you're cutting across clades, you have absolutely no good, solid information on life history, on the ecological context, the phylogenetic context, you name it. So we are not at a place where maybe you guys may be, where you take every single study that has been done on a given clade of birds, and you have very strong, very solid life history. I mean, you're talking 70 years of data on your system, right? And 2,000 individuals, who knows how many generations, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, maybe we'll follow up. It'll be fun to get together and talk some more about this. I definitely want to do it, but I also need to go back and look at the papers in detail. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. Next we have Jinu.
Yeah, hello, I'm Jinu from University of Strasbourg and Indirect in France. So I have rather general questions. So to your knowledge, does family living always can bring benefits in population or even species level, or does it normally only brings the benefits to the parents in individuals level? Like, does the family living species always do better than non-family living species under the same environment?
Well, I don't think I can really give you a straight answer here, because again, it's just very similar to what I answered to Eduardo. It's about the life history package. So if you, and the niche. So if you have a species that is non-family living, I mean, obviously all species out there are perfectly adapted to do the job perfectly, you know, else they go extinct. So if you start comparing species, I don't think you can say that like it's an advantage strategy. It's just a different strategy to solve the same problem of life, you know, to be successful and spread your genes. And so to do that in a short-lived species, you know, that cannot live in families, well, you still can. So this is like the, you know, the picture with the different social cooperative breeding system with the long-tailed tits. They're relatively short-lived. So what they do is they breed, they form flocks, multiple families team up, you know, a big flock. And then in there they pair up, everybody goes and breeds on their own, those that survive. And then most pairs actually have only one reproductive attempt per life. If you fail early on, you go and help kin. So you get an indirect fitness benefit by doing that. So you basically live in the best of two worlds by having the direct fitness benefit of always reproducing, but also the indirect fitness benefits of because you are in the kin neighborhood and you can do this. So, you know, therefore, I think that it's just a different solution to the same problem.
Can't really say like which strategy is more advanced. Either.
Well, you know, advanced, this is like, again, you know, it's just a different, you need to solve the problem differently. You know, if you're a short-lived species, you really, you know, you have a tough life. You know, as a juvenile, you leave soon after independence, you have some things together. You might, you know, use flocking, whatever, to get to your skill set you need to reproduce successfully. You have maybe 1-2 attempts in your life. It's really hard work, you know, for a blue tit to raise whatever, 10, 12, 15 young, and then you're dead, but you left your genes. So it's kind of fun to do all the long-lived stuff, right, if you can do it in a short time. You could argue, or you can argue, well, why do this? You know, you can live long and you have a couple of offspring and take care for them forever, like we do.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I cannot really give you a good answer.
Oh, it's okay.
If that is okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's never, yeah, I think it's better like a straight answer from that, because that's kind of bothering everyone. It's kind of like solitary and group. That it's so solitary should be the first, should come the first, and the group after. Just like I think the animal should maybe start with no cares for the offspring and then develop this all kinds of care.
Well, okay, if you look at the phylogenetic times across the whole avian tree, you know, I don't remember what actually, I mean, we did reconstruct it, but we have to redo it once the newer phylogeny is out. I mean, there's very few transitions of, you know, from precocial to altricial births, but I think it starts with precocials, if I remember right. And so within the tree, you know, if you don't look at non-family, family, and cooperative breeding, you have a lot of transitions. This is really different from mammals. So it's very fluid. So this just shows, you know, the environment changes, the thing changes there. You change your social system because it's more beneficial in a given moment to be in a different social system. And so, you know, this high fluidity simply shows that there's no best solution, right? It's always depending on the circumstances, what you actually express socially.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the answers.
Well, welcome. I hope I could answer your question.
Okay, thanks, Jinyu. I was wondering, do we have any questions on the YouTube channel?
No, there's nothing.
Okay. Okay, you can ask your question, Carsten.
So just to extend to what Jing you said, and I think you maybe have just answered it, and I was looking at something else. When you look at your phylogenetic analysis, coming back to your figure summarizing your PLOS paper, the arrow from family living to non-family living is much fatter than the other way around. Does that not indicate that on average the non-family livings in the long term are doing better?
No, so the problem is with this arrow fatness is, so the sum of the arrows pointing to all of the social system are proportional to the current occurrence of these social systems. So meaning, given that non-family living is the most abundant social system in birds, we have to have the thickest arrows going to there.
But doesn't that by automatically say that on average it's more successful? Otherwise, if living in families would be so great, then everybody would do it.
Sure, but again, you know, so I mean, you know, if you compare the evolutionary success across species, I think, you know, we will need to use different phylogenetic tools and analysis really to see how the success of a lineage is in evolutionary times. Where the problem is that we do not know all the extinct branches, what they basically are. So this is a very tricky one because, you know, depending on which branches went extinct, we don't know the true phylogeny and therefore the true success of species, so to speak. I mean, at the current moment, if you look at the top of the tree, at the branches, at the tips, sure, non-family living is the most successful. However, it depends how you measure success. If you measure success as their evolutionary, you know, continuity over the whole tree, and you will look backward and forward, it might look different. So I can't give you really a correct answer to that.
Okay. I always have the feeling cooperative breeders in mammals are dead ends of evolution. Because I mean, maybe with the exception of calitrichids. But of many of the others, I don't know.
Yeah, but you know, so I think that's the difference between mammals and birds. I mean, right? I mean, in mammals, given that only the mothers can initially provide care as long as they're in the womb, and then suckle the young in utterly almost all species, this limits the set of help that can be provided. So, you know, I therefore really think this is a very different story in mammals. I mean, sure. I mean, in birds. It's more successful, apparently, you know, because it's more easy to provide help.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. Does anyone else have another question, or do we end it there? I don't know. I
think I end in the live stream. And then we can still, if somebody wants, we can still chat a bit between us. But once again, thank you very much for Michael for a great talk, and thanks a lot for Lindelani for very good moderation.
Oh, thank you all for your attention and all the good questions. Very